got Martin Thar here. She's our chief mastering engineer. Hey, Maggie.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How you doing today?
I'm all right.
All right. Yeah, I think that's the new good is all right. That's what
Yeah,
I've heard.
it's good. It's good enough for now.
Yeah. So, who are you exactly?
Um, so I'm Maggie. I'm a mastering engineer at Welcome to 1979. My background before I got into mastering, which was quite a bit of number of years ago at this point, was in like classical jazz acoustic recording. So I come from kind of a conservatory style music background. Um, and over time, I graduated from college in 2005, and then I got my master's. And between then and now, I've worked a whole bunch of different sorts of audio jobs, and I found a path kind of into mastering during that time. And I don't really know how I got into it, other than that opportunities presented itself, and kind of like anything else in the world, you kind of fall into something that works well for you, hopefully. So
Yeah.
I've been at 79 now since September, and I've before that I was working as a mastering engineer at Chicago Mastering Service, and before that I was living in Norway, also working as a mastering engineer. And also doing acoustic recordings and the occasional film sound thing. I got to record someone speaking on the top of a fjord once, which was kind of cool. I got
Oh,
to go up
wow.
in a helicopter, so it was kind of fun. But yeah, so that's
Yeah.
kind of what my background is. And at 79, I'm a mastering engineer, which the way I like to describe it as it's the last step of the creative process and the first step of the manufacturing process. It's kind of a QC sort of step where my goal is to make the audio sound cohesive and whole and technically correct on whatever formats you happen to be releasing on, whether it's vinyl or CD or digital streaming, whatever. Um, and it's an artistic process, but there's also kind of a methodical like quality control check that I have to do also, which is
Mhm.
I think very important, particularly when it comes to vinyl mastering. Um, Mainly because there's just so many there's so many steps in the process that everything has to kind of go pretty smoothly. So that's kind of a very, very general um, background on who I am and what I do.
Okay.
So
Cool. Yeah, and for those that haven't seen this Q&A in quarantine series, obviously we're heavy on the questions and answers. We don't
mhm.
want to just talk to each other, but hopefully you'll learn a lot. I've got a lot of technical stuff and some creative stuff, but I think the first question I have for you, Maggie, is who's your least favorite Tiger King person?
Oh, man, I really think Carol did it. Whatever it is, you have to watch the show. But
Hmm.
yeah, I don't know. There are all so many. There's so many interesting personalities on that show that I think I can't believe any of them exist. So,
Yeah,
although I'm a big fan of Joe's clothing. It's big. It's very, very big. Oh, hey, Michael. It's good to
yeah,
see you virtually. So yeah, so that's what I have to say about Tiger King. That's been keeping me sane in a very odd way for the past week or
yeah.
so.
I think it's good to see crazy to go, oh, okay, I've got it
Yeah,
together.
yeah, and it just
I'm holding it
keeps
together.
getting crazier. It never gets any less crazy. Yeah.
Oh, cool. So, you know, I'm going to ask you some questions that I may know the answer to, just to
Hmm.
ask questions. But we hang out a lot at work and we answer a lot of team emails. This is a great forum to just kind of, do some of our frequently asked. Is mastering is such a confusing
Hmm.
term,
Yes.
right? Because it evolved,
Hmm.
right? So, what is the difference in 2000 in 2020? What's the difference between mastering and vinyl mastering?
Well, I would say that they're both the same idea. So, just to give you guys, if you don't know what mastering is, kind of a very, very quick historical timeline. Back in the day, back when everything was recorded to tape and then put onto a record for everyone to listen to, a mastering engineer was basically a transfer engineer that took those tapes and transferred them onto the lacquer master that then was used to make the vinyl records. So there was an art to it, but there was also much less of a freedom and creativity. It was more like tape does this weird stuff, vinyl does this weird stuff to audio. Like, we have to find a way to make them work together, and so we can have a good recording or a good record for people to listen to. Over time, and especially as, you know, in the 80s, DAWs, digital software, plugins, all that sort of stuff started making it much more of a creative process where people were like, oh, we can like really change things up and the really make things interesting because we have a lot more tools besides just tape kind of at our disposal. So as it kind of stands right now, I kind of see mastering as vinyl mastering is different, is dealing with the deliverable side of the quality control process. So it's important to understand when you say, hey, I want to get this mastered for vinyl, what does that actually mean? What is the actual vinyl making process? And what are some things that occasionally I might do differently if I'm preparing something for like to be distributed onto a record versus distributed onto Spotify? So there's a couple things that I would say are good guidelines. Again, it's always project dependent. It's always music dependent. There are very few things that are like always, always, always. It's just things to be aware of when you're working with the medium. It's just it's a medium that you have to know how to deal with. So
yeah, because a lot of the questions that we tend to answer together are, you know, I don't want to do this wrong or mess it up, and that's really the case. There's just like a better way to do it.
Yeah,
you know,
best practices.
Yeah, and you know, I really do feel for artists and labels because music gets released at different times and different formats, and you know, and we'll kind of get into that too. But that's a really good description. And I've got some questions, and we'll get to that in a minute. Oh, good. Ed really liked that explanation too, because like you said, historically, you know, it was vinyl mastering was a transfer process, and then certain engineers started making sonic changes as they did this and became busy doing that, and then they got hired just to do that for multiple formats when other formats came out.
Yeah.
So then now, since there are multiple formats, it really gets confusing, you know.
Yeah, it can. And I think one of the important skills that a mastering engineer needs to have is to be able to objectively kind of decide what works and what doesn't work for a particular format when they're treating the audio. Just kind of being able to look into the future, and it's especially, I think, hard for mastering engineers in terms of communication, because unlike a mix engineer or a recording engineer, you know, you might be working with someone, Chris, for like 6 months. So you understand everything that they say, you know, you know what they really mean, what they want, what their references are. Because even if people tell me what their references are, it doesn't always give me all the information I need. Whereas, you know, a mastering engineer, I'm basically like, unless I've worked with the client before, which is a different story, I get this audio, and within like 24 hours, I have to learn like everything about the project. I have to learn, you know, what are your goals for this? Like, where are you know, are you going to put this out on Spotify? Do you want to cut a record with this? Have you made an order with a pressing plant? Like all of these things. So a lot of times I end up sending out like a questionnaire when I start a project, because, and it seems tedious. Like me, like, why is she asking me like what the song order is? Well, I don't know what your song order is. So I need to find that out before I start working. So it's a lot of like very quick information gathering in order for me to start the process of kind of helping you figure out like what you need. So.
Well, you make a great point too, because song order doesn't really matter for Spotify.
No,
it matters.
Not really.
Not to start the process. You could master all the songs, give them to the artist, they upload it, right? But on vinyl mastering, you need to know that ahead of time.
Yes.
And you know, I toggle between like owner of a business and engineer producer. So sometimes I'm answering emails, I'm getting frustrated with projects and needing to gather information. And then even last month, I hand a project over to you, Maggie, that I produced and mixed. And you asked, I didn't have any of the stuff you need, right?
That's happened a few times, Chris.
Yeah, I know. And so okay. So I developed Facebook so we could do Facebook Live and teach people. No. But it's given me a lot of respect for everyone else, because I'm already, as a producer engineer, in pre-production meetings for the next project while I'm buttoning mixes, and I just need to get it to somebody, you know?
Yeah.
But I've been working personally to get that information, to make the artist I'm working with aware of the things you're going to need, as I enter the mixing stage. That's what I've been doing
Mhm.
from my side of the console. Um, and to that end, Maggie, why don't you walk us through like the perfect scenario for a multiple format release, Spotify, vinyl, from a logistics standpoint.
Yeah.
Let's not talk
So
about the music since there's so many
mhm,
variables there. But
yeah.
how you get stuff, when you get it,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, that's great. So like ideally if, you know, it's a client I've never worked with before, they're like, "Hey, we want you to do the mastering for this. We want to release it on CD, digital distribution, and a record." Um, and if you can give me, your song titles in the order that you want, if you've thought about the vinyl sequence, that would be great. Like if you're like, I kind of want, this is the order I want for digital and CD, but vinyl, I know that like the sides need to be a certain length, so I'm putting breaks in, this side or that side. Sometimes an artist doesn't have that when they come to me, and that's fine too. And usually what I do is I say, this is the sequence that I have for vinyl. You also want a CD. What, have you thought about what you might want for the record sequence versus the CD sequence? We can have that discussion. But it's great if you
Mhm.
already know that stuff, or if you're like, this is what I think I want, let me know what you think. Because sometimes if it's like, well, I have a 26-minute side and a 15-minute side, I'll probably be like, maybe we should, for a 12-inch 33 RPM record, that's a very large discrepancy. I'll probably be like, let's bring some songs over from the side B so it's more
Mhm.
even in length and everything. So then, yeah, so I get all that information. Any other metadata you might have, like a UPC code for a CD, anything like that. And then usually what I do is I start with like two reference tracks or two tracks in the sequence if it's a whole album. Let's say it's a 10-song album. And I usually listen through all the tracks and I find out like the two that either sound the most varied. So maybe like a quieter song or a song that's more of a ballad, and then like a louder rock song. And I work with those songs, and then I give them to the client to listen to reference. And once they're happy with those, then I use those to kind of gauge the rest of the album. I've been doing that for a while now, and in other places that I've worked, and I found that tends to produce the most efficient sort of result, where I'm not spending a couple hours on a whole album and then the client coming back and saying, oh, I really like the high end on all of these tracks, like could you add some sibilance back, and then I have to go back and do everything. So it tends to make things clearer to me also, again, because I'm learning about the process and this person on a very short time frame. I'm learning more about what they want. Even if they ask me to do revisions on those two tracks, I know more about kind
Mhm.
of where they're coming from. So then, yeah, so usually if I'm doing the mastering, I'll do the digital mastering first. So that would be digital distribution for CD, um, streaming. If I
Mhm.
know you want vinyl also, um, I take that into account when I'm just doing the mastering in general, because, excuse me, one of the main things that I'm concerned about when I'm cutting a record is like sibilance from a lot of S's, or like a lot of really high frequency content, like a triangle or something,
Mhm.
and low end kind of bass management. So if I kind of treat your music sonically well and have things balanced, I usually don't have to do as much to the audio, if anything, when I'm cutting it. So the goal is to make it kind of as seamless a transition as possible. One thing that I almost always do differently between digital and vinyl is I try to take a limiter off. If I have a limiter on a digital distribution set, to have it up to a loudness level that's appropriate for whatever service I'm have you're distributing stuff on. I usually take that off when I cut, because the way a limiter works, particularly if it's chopping off peaks and it's kind of making the more of a square wave, it can be harder for the stylus that cuts the actual lacquer to trace those waveforms. And it's not
Mhm.
going to make your record any louder. It's not going to be like, wow, I have a limiter on and everything's louder. If anything, it might make it sound not quite as nice and clear. So that's something I always do differently. Um,
Mhm.
Other than that, a lot of times if I do the mastering properly, I don't really have to do a whole lot when I'm cutting the lacquers. So ideally, that's like the best case scenario. Um, and so yeah, so and the other thing with the vinyl process is that the digital distribution things, I can do that pretty quickly, because I can just give you the files and then you can upload your stuff to CD Baby and it's fine. But vinyl, there's that extra part of, after I cut those lacquer masters, it has to go through plating, and then it has to be sent to a pressing plant. So there's that added step that the client also needs to place an order with, whatever pressing plant they happen to want to use. And sometimes artists don't know that right away. Like, oh, we think we want to put it out on vinyl, but we're not sure. And that's fine. Like, if you want, I've waited, 6 months where people are like, we just got to get some more money to do it. And then I've cut the lacquers for them. And that's totally fine too. Because it is a little bit more complicated than just like uploading a bunch of tracks to a aggregator.
Okay, so
Mhm.
sounds like the artist or producer, and a lot of people we deal with are the artist mixer themselves, right?
Mhm.
Or the mixing engineer. Kind of have to get in contact with you during the process to
Mhm.
get these things, right?
Yes.
Because it sounds like song order could be you might have a recommendation to change that
Mhm.
on vinyl, right?
Mhm.
And that would also obviously be helpful to have that information before artwork is done, right?
Yes.
Because once the
Yes.
once
That's
the
that's a
CD
good
jackets
point.
are
That's
print,
important too.
you know, yeah. So and then a lot of things you kind of touched on, um, almost sound like a lot of back and forth. I mean, there's logistics,
Mhm.
there's sonics. So, um, talk to me about your ideal working relationship with a mix engineer or an artist mixer,
Mhm.
um, and kind of how that kind of works because we've got a good enough back and forth now with mixing in the box. Things aren't People don't have to get all freaked out if something isn't right. They can
Yeah.
kind of bounce the stuff off you, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and I appreciate. I mean, I don't get it as much as I used to, I guess, and I think it's just a comes and goes depending. I don't think there's any real reason, but people used to ask me for more mixed feedback, and I actually really enjoyed
Mhm.
that. Because a lot of times the people who were asking me for mixed feedback, they either knew exactly what was going to be wrong or what they thought was wrong, or there really wasn't
Mhm.
anything problematic. They just wanted reassurance, which is totally fine, and I get it. You're sending your stuff, your mixes off to someone that you might not know, and you're a little bit anxious and nervous, or maybe you've never sent anything to a proper mastering engineer before. So I like giving mixed feedback. Um, One of the harder things I noticed when I started mastering, and I actually touched on this yesterday when I was talking to the Millikan students, is I kind of had to start listening to things differently than I did when I mean, I still do recording, but much less than I used to. And the transition was different. Whereas, like, when you're a recording engineer or tracking, mixing engineer, whatever, you can kind of be like, oh, this is the kick drum sound that I really want, or this is the vocal sound that I want. And I have the same, this is my chain, and this is how I like it and everything. But it's subjective to a degree. Whereas a mastering
Mhm.
engineer, I might not necessarily like every choice that a client gives me, but it's not a subjective choice for me to deal with. So I have to kind of work with the music in a more objective manner versus, oh, what would I have done differently, or do they want me to change this, or do they not want me to change this? And that's only something that, like, I've learned over time.
Mhm.
Because it's kind of, you're listening to things differently and you're using your ears differently. And so yeah, I I
Okay.
appreciate mixed feedback, and I also appreciate a client or an artist that has kind of an idea of what they want their music to sound like, or what they like, or
Mhm.
what genre it is. Like, just tell me when you're writing me that email and I'm asking you questions, tell me, like, artists that you like, that inspired you when you were mixing this, or, you know, this is my favorite record. I know it's, I've had people give me references for things that their music is nothing like, but they've told me,
Mhm.
like, I like the cymbal sound in this record. If we could make it sound kind of like, a little crisper than what it is now, like more like that, that would be great. So, like, anything like that would help me, relate to your music better is good. Um, Track order doesn't matter as much, obviously, for digital distribution, but in terms of spacing and stuff on a CD, it kind of is important. So if you have crossfades and stuff that you want, let me know what
Mhm.
what you want for those things. Or, if you've already kind of done a mock-up MP3 version of how you kind of want the crossfades to go, like, give me that too. And then I can use that as a guide for when I'm doing it myself. Cause sometimes stuff can get very specific, or people have different references when they're talking about how to do a fade. So,
Yeah.
um, more information, the better. And to feel comfortable, talk just like anything else, to be able to feel comfortable with the people you're working with. And I've kind of worked in all extremes, where people just give me files and I just do what I want, And then other times where it's much more involved and, that sort of process. So,
Yeah, no, because I've checked in with you a couple times after a few projects have gone by. I'm like, hey, do you notice any trends that you're doing to my mixes
mhm.
specifically? You know what I mean? And I'm usually talking about frequency
I'm crushing them. I'm crushing them, Chris.
response, or you mean like crushing them like they're awesome, or
I'm just compressing the crap out of them. No,
yeah. But through
yeah,
that, I've learned, oh, okay, so I've got a Maxim plugin, for instance, on my two mix at the end, for volume, and I just now take that off after, like when I bounce my high res, I take that off because the client doesn't need that 4 dB of headroom. I just kind of changed things a little bit after talking with you about not things you had to fix, but things that would make your life easier.
yeah.
And then, so
Well,
let's jump into some questions. We got some. Oh, what were you gonna say?
oh no, I was just gonna say that another thing too is that once you've worked with a mix engineer like more than a couple projects, you start to notice patterns in just how they
Yeah.
do things. So like some of the mixes that you give me, Chris, it's not a criticism at all. It's just I end up maybe ducking a little bit of the low mids out because they sometimes sound a
Hmm.
little muddy. But it's not
Yeah.
because it's bad. It's like it's the same thing, which is actually a very good compliment because it means that you're being consistent in your work, which makes my job
Mhm.
easier. So it's like that helps consistency.
Yeah. And you gave me that feedback, and then I was listening, and I'm like, you know what? I just like that in there for
Hmm.
when it helps me place things. When I duck it out that dB, it just weirded me out. So I just put it back in, not knowing it was good. The mix is you can take care of that, and it's not a battle.
Yeah,
And I feel better with it in there, right? And
yeah,
we had
and
that
that's not a
conversation.
big.
So,
A lot of
no,
people do
mm-mm,
that too. That's a pretty common
yeah,
thing actually that I've noticed in a lot of stuff. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's I can I
yeah.
it's fine. So
And then I just felt reassured, and I can just mix and not think about it, and I love it. So we got some questions here. I'm
mhm.
going to pop on the screen. What is the best LUFS level for YouTube / Vimeo uploads?
um so I forget what the exact I need to look at that. I have a sheet from Production Advice UK that has like all the standards and they change pretty dramatically. I know Spotify is still minus 14. I think YouTube is minus 16. Um, I don't master things specifically for any one digital streaming format, mainly because it would take way too much time. Um,
Hmm.
that being said, I will export 24/48 files for film, like for instrumental versions if people want that, but that's not really the same sort of situation. Um, I tend to find that a lot of the mixes that I personally work on that I think sound good on multiple digital formats tend to be anywhere between I would say minus 10 or 11 at like the loudest LUFs and like minus 12 or 13. Spotify's minus 14, which means that when they turn everything down, you're only losing like 2 dB of overall level, which most people are not. It's not going to be that much quieter when you're listening to it on your streaming service. Um, so that's my deal. That's how I do it. Other people may do things differently. I tend to just find where the music sits the best and fits the best. So if it's not too fatiguing, if it's not too in your face, if it doesn't hurt. So try turning, my trick is you turn up the music really loud for like a couple seconds and you see if it all falls apart or it hurts. And it'll hurt because it's loud, but like in terms of the frequency content, and then hit your dim button and listen to how the balance is of everything on your monitoring system. And you shouldn't really lose anything when you're listening at a low level either. It should stay pretty balanced. So, from my own personal experience, around minus 12 is where I think things fit well and are able to kind of be distributed into most of these streaming, Vimeo. I don't even know what Vimeo's actual standard is. I'm sorry, I just don't know that one off the top of my head. But they change all the time too, so who knows if it's even the same today as it was yesterday. But yeah, so I would just if you get a good balance between instruments and between vocals and everything else, it should, for me, usually around minus 12 is a good level. But again, I can only speak for myself. So
So we've got a lot of questions. It's awesome.
hmm.
So let's get another digital question in
Mhm.
here. And we got some vinyl ones too. Um,
Oh,
Sophie
hey Sophie.
says,
Hey, Sophie, I knew
Yeah,
you.
she wants to know what mastering software we use for
Hmm.
digital mastering, which programs are industry standard,
Hmm.
and if she wanted to start mastering music independently, where should she start and build up to? So that's a lot of questions, but
Yeah,
maybe just
yeah.
just to gloss over on that one.
So I'll name a few programs. So first of all, WaveLab is a really big one, and actually WaveLab has a 30-day free trial. Like if you download, you have to have an e-licenser, but you can download it and play around with it if you want. I also really like Sequoia. That's my favorite PC-based mastering software. Pyramix is another one that's also used. That's also used a lot in classical recording. So if you have a background in that, that also works really well for that. One of the differences between mastering software and just Pro Tools or some other DAW that's mainly used for mixing and recording is that it has the ability to export multiple formats with metadata. So you can export a DDP, which is a disk description protocol, which is basically the format for a Redbook CD standard. So you can export that at the same time you export digital files. At the same time you export, a sequence for vinyl cutting and all sorts of stuff. So it tends to be a little bit more in depth on the delivering or deliverable side of things versus like Pro Tools, which is more just for mixing and recording. So yeah, that's what I would say for those. Sequoia, WaveLab, those are probably my favorite. Again, it's a personal preference. Some people like others better. So
Okay. Got some pretty in-depth mastering, vinyl mastering questions here.
mm.
And while I pop these up, I'm going to show some photos. Um, so Ben wants to know, are we cutting the master at half speed? And is that pretty standard? So you
um,
want a brief description of what that is? I'm going to show
yeah,
your working volume here.
yeah. So
There's
there's the
your,
lathe.
office.
So
Yeah.
I've never cut anything at half speed. I know that a lot of there's a very strong history in that where the idea is basically if you're cutting it at half speed, you can trace the waveforms better and it allows for better high frequency response and all that sort of stuff. Um, I've never done it. I've gotten a lot of good cuts by not doing it. So I would say that there probably are people who do it. I'm not exactly sure who does, but
We get a lot of them from Miles from Abbey Road
oh,
for
okay,
electroplating.
okay. So
He writes on the dead wax that it's half speed mastering. So even walking by, you can see
mhm.
the long dead wax
Yeah,
notes. So
yeah, and
yeah,
I see why people do it, but I've never personally, and I've never felt that oh man, I wish I could have done this at half speed because it would have sounded so much better. Obviously, if you're cutting at Abbey Road, it's gonna it's gonna sound good no matter what you're doing. So
yeah, and the theory behind it was they would slow the tape down at half speed and then cut the disc at half speed. So the high frequencies, which are hard to cut, are half the frequency. But my theory now is I haven't tested it. That's why it's a theory. Is low frequency content in music today is so much greater than it was in the 60s and
mm,
70s that then that frequency, think about, a big pop record or rock record, all
yeah,
those low frequencies are even lower,
yeah,
and
that's it. I hadn't thought about that. That's true. I didn't. I mean, it could be something to that. I don't know personally, but huh.
yeah, and then think about listening to music at half speed and making sonic decisions, you know, and then having to listen to it at full speed, and so it takes a
Yeah.
lot longer.
Hmm.
Even if it wasn't a half speed, it would take longer because you have to listen to it,
Yeah.
Oh, hey, Bucky. So Bucky has it here. What's your opinion of the quality of direct to metal mastering?
Oh.
So,
Um.
yeah,
I
let's talk
mean,
about the differences
yeah.
because quality is a weird word. Let's just
Yeah.
talk about
Well,
the differences and what people
yeah.
decide.
So direct to metal mastering. So there's no. So that picture that Chris showed, for those of you who don't know what it is, the lathe with where I'm sitting with the black lacquer disc. That's when I talk about the work I do. That's what I cut the masters to, which is an aluminum disc. It's I think the other one where it's the side of my head has the actual that.
Right.
So you can see that there's like a black disc on the surface of the platter there. So it's an aluminum disc covered with nitrocellulose acetate, and it's a softer material than PVC, so it scratches pretty easily, but it also has a much significantly lower noise floor. So that's what I use to cut masters on, which then it is sent up to plating, where they plate it and make these stampers that are then sent off to the pressing plant. Direct metal mastering doesn't have that. Yeah, so those are like the stampers that would then get sent to the pressing plant to like actually make the records. Basically, if I'm correct about the way DMM works entirely, is you're basically just cutting the audio directly onto a metal stamper with the, acetate. It's not a part of it. And I know that there's some people who say that like the high frequency response is better. It's a little brighter. Occasionally people will say like, oh, I've had people be like, oh, we like the way the DMM sounds for this record versus the other cut that we did or whatever. Can you make it sound more like the DMM? Which usually, to me, it's brighter. It's a brighter sound, which can be beneficial for certain types of music. But I can also get a pretty good sounding record not doing that. So I think a lot of it's personal preference, in my opinion anyway. And I try not to take sides in a lot of stuff. But I think the main difference that I hear is the brightness thing, which, if you're happy with the way it sounds, if you like, the way that this DMM sounds versus a regular, one that was cut the way that I do, that's fine. It's personal preference. So
yeah, and from a manufacturing standpoint, DMM is brilliant, right? Because it skips, right? But like anything that's technically better, it sometimes doesn't sound as good. Couple analogies is a lacquer is like tape, and you're skipping that the lacquer has a sound to it that you're skipping, and like a tube amp isn't, like a solid state guitar amp is technically better than a tube amp, right? But people tend to prefer the tube amps because what a solid state doesn't do is the power doesn't sag on chords, but that makes a sound. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like
it's a sound like anything else. It's like how mastering engineers have a couple different compressors with different, different tubes in it or whatever else to give it a certain sound or a certain color. So
yeah, I will say this though, there aren't any that I know of DMM lays in the U.S. So if DMM is involved, it's typically overseas. And the reason I say that is a lot of artists I work with and Maggie works with and that I know care where their money is spent and where their work goes. So if DMM is mentioned, it's something that the project's being sent overseas for pressing. So just be aware of that. If you decide to do that, awesome. But you could be using people and friends in the U.S. to get projects pressed. Let me see. There's one more vinyl question, and then we've got some other general questions. So Garrett wants to know what attributes then you make an album unfit for a vinyl release. Side length that you mentioned, which is the length, how much music is on one side of the record, frequency, content, etc. What you got, Maggie?
So I wouldn't say that anything is really unfit for a vinyl release. Like most music sounds okay on a vinyl record or really good. I mean, certain genres of music kind of flatter the frequency response better. But I would say that the side length is really important. So if you're talking, again, I'm referring to a 12-inch 33 RPM record because that's what kind of is what I cut the most and what I think most people probably purchase. The max length that I prefer to cut is, in the low 20s. So somewhere between like 15, 16 minutes and 22 minutes, maybe 23, if it's possible. When you start bringing side lengths to me where maybe it's 27 or 28 minutes, even if the music is sonically very good, it's going to be harder for me to fit that physically on the record because, again, this is a physical medium, so you're constrained by like an actual product, right? So in order for me to get that music to fit on that record, I'm going to have to cut I'm going to have to use the whole side of the record, which includes the inner groove distortion with the high frequency content that I'm sure many of you know about and or have heard of. But I'm going to have to cut into that because otherwise I want to make it as loud as I can because there's a surface noise, right, in a record. And so I want to make sure that the music, even at its quietest spot, is still above the noise floor. Otherwise, you're going to hear more surface noise on the record, which you're going to hear it anyway, but you don't want to be really distracted by it. And if the quieter the music gets, the more likely that's going to be the case. So I would say that side length, more so than a lot of other stuff, is like kind of across the board something that needs to be considered. If there's a little bit, if I have to de-ess something to make it, not distort as much on a record, or if I have to do anything like that, like that's problematic. That can be problematic too. But side length is something that's usually pretty easily fixable just by moving, getting rid of a song or two, or moving them over to the other side. That doesn't
Or
require
making
me
it
to
a double
change.
LP,
What?
or making it a double LP.
Yeah, or a double LP, anything like that. Like that's something that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the sound quality of the files you're giving me. It's simply a how much music can you fit on a side situation.
Yeah, and it's strange too because the volume of a record. I don't know how to phrase this. The amount of music on one side determines the volume, which is unlike any other format, right?
Well, and also the dynamic range too. I mean,
Yeah.
if a couple songs are really quiet or have like very quiet sections, you can fit more. Like,
Yeah.
In theory, you can fit more music on the side, but yet it is more so than anything else. I mean, I guess you could say also a CD, because you can only fit like 76 minutes of music, but most people don't have to worry about that so much on.
Right, but if the music's louder, it's still 76 minutes if it's
Yeah, that's
quieter.
true. Yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
Yeah, so an analogy I'm working on is, imagine your car. The speed of your car is determined by the loudness of your stereo. And you've got a block to drive, and if you turn it up too loud, you're going to get to the stop sign before the song's over, basically. So you have to turn it down. Just think about it like that,
Yeah.
because it matters. Let me see. I think we've got a. Let's switch off vinyl for a second. Here we go. Here's an interesting question. Aaron wants to know, sometimes my mixes start hurting my ears. Is there a plug-in or EQ problem?
Oh, okay. Well, that's a good question. So, how loud are you listening to your music? There's two questions. So, what is your monitoring level? How long are you listening at that monitoring level? And how long are you working? And also, how bright are your mixes? So, the way like Fletcher Munson curves work in our ears and how we hear sort of that mid-range, or not mid-range, that presency area, like between 3 and 7K ish, 2 and 7, I guess, depending on the tone of a person's voice. A lot more than say 400 hertz or something like that. We have more sensitivity to it. And so if you're adding a lot of presence to your mixes, or if you're making things really bright, and then at the same time you're listening at a very, very loud level on your stereo system or on your monitoring system, that's going to fatigue your ears. So I try not to listen to music for like long periods of time at a loud level. That's something that I usually don't do. And I actually really don't ever do that anyway. I try not to, and I wear hearing protection when I go to concerts. So I would say check, get a decibel meter and just look at what you're listening to and how long you're listening to things at a high level, and just vary it too. You also want to make sure that your mixes sound good at a low level, like what I was saying before, where I hit the dim button and I want to make sure nothing falls apart. So try just varying your levels. I without knowing your music, or anything about you as an artist, I can't tell you if it's your music, but I would say watch how much higher frequency content you're adding to your mixes, and how loud you're listening to your music, and how long you're listening to the music that loud. So
Okay, cool. So kind of a jump on that one. Caleb wants to know, what is the most common issue or issues you have to fix other than over loud, over compressed mixes?
I actually don't have to. Now that you mentioned that, I don't actually have to really fix too many over loud, over compressed mixes, so to speak. Recently, the last couple years, I've been fortunate, and most people don't send me stuff that looks like a rectangle. But I would say that a little bit of muddiness, like what I was telling Chris, with like removing a little bit of low mids, not a lot, but just a little, because it makes vocals come forward a little more, because adds a little bit more space because there's a lot of stuff happening between like 100 and 400 hertz with guitars and toms and bass guitar and everything. So if I carve out a little more space there, vocals can sometimes come forward a little bit more.
Mhm.
So that can then maybe help me not have to add so much limiting or compression on my end or something like that. Other problems. Pops and clicks sometimes. So like noise removal, like sometimes bad edits slip through. And I mean, it's not always, doesn't usually happen, but sometimes it does. And I understand, like, can't necessarily catch everything. So noise removal, um, and just kind of finding a good place for things in the mix, um, within the stereo image. So things sound like, I don't know, so you can place them. And that's something that I'm really aware of when I'm using compression or limiting is I never want a stereo image to kind of collapse and fall apart. I always want every instrument and every a vocal part to kind of be where it needs to be. And so yeah, there's some tricks for that too. Like instead of compressing things, like the other question was, my mixes hurt my ears sometimes, and he asked if it was an EQ problem or not. Well, you can use that to your advantage too. You can make things a little brighter in the presence boost of like the guitars and vocals, and it'll give the appearance sonically of it being a little bit louder. So sometimes I'll do that if I want things to pop a little more. There's not really that much I have to fix. It's just usually massaging things to work within the confines of what I've been given. I guess it's a better way to put it.
Yeah. And I will say though, a lot of what I see you doing is having to reach back to clients for the mix was sent in the wrong format or it's clipped at the end. It's like the music is fine.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah,
the song was cut at the end, or this one's an MP3 instead of this, or this is a different. You know
yeah,
what I mean? Just
yeah.
so
That's
that
true.
small,
That's true.
yeah. So which just kind of slows everything down.
Yeah, which is
Um,
why I asked for that boring questionnaire when I asked for projects because it hopefully makes things a little easier for me. But
okay, so here's one. It's too long to put on the screen. Mark Green wants to know. Back to vinyl for a
mhm.
second. How are we managing to get lacquers after the Apollo fire?
Mm.
Same with Style Eye. For those of you who don't know, there are two companies worldwide that make the raw material of a lacquer that we buy, and one of them burned down in January, February, early February.
I think it was the end of was it the end of January? I think it was the end of January, something like
Yeah,
that.
right in there.
Yeah.
So we were buying from the other company for years anyway. The vast majority of our lacquers. So luckily we weren't affected. Um, so we've been going just fine. And then Style Eye, we have another source for that too. But we're actively working on a solution for both of those too. So it hasn't really affected us. Just
You have to be
we're
more
in
aware of it. I mean, it's just
yeah,
I think it's a more of an awareness across the industry in general is like we just have to be a little bit more deliberate in the things that we do and making sure everything's okay with our stock and stuff just like anything else. I mean, and it's amazing to me that there were only two companies anyway like
yeah,
that were making them. So it's already like a kind of a like everything else precarious. So,
yeah.
mhm.
So odd industry. So Sophie wants to
Mm.
know, what do you do if the mixes you receive are poorly mixed or formatted, stereo bus has processing, etc., and the mixing engineer or artist won't budge?
Then that's a myth. So I think one of the things that I've learned in the last couple years is you have to learn how to manage expectations. So if that's what the client is happy with, and again, poorly mixed, is that subjective or is that objective? Do you think it's poorly mixed because you don't like the way it sounds, or is it poorly mixed because like there are phase issues and like there's frequencies being canceled out? Like what does poorly mixed mean? If it's subjective, I don't really have much control over that. If it's objective, that's different. Saying objective in this scenario, like there's things wrong with the mixes. So if you're saying the artist won't budge, that means that I've already spoken to them and told them, these are the things I notice. These are the things that might be problematic. I'm going to work to do my best to get you the product that you want, but I just want to let you know that these are the issues that I find. So it's about managing expectations because if they can't change anything, or if they don't want to, or I don't know, they don't have access to the files anymore or whatever, then I have to work with what I'm given, which is fine. But then you have to kind of manage an expectation. So like this happens sometimes when I have to cut really long sides. So if someone gives me 27-minute sides and like, nope, we need to have it that way, like that's what we want. I'm like, okay, I can do that. But let me tell you what might be a problem. And then
and I think and the goal is an informed decision. They go, okay, you've given me information to weigh these, and I'm going to make a decision based on that. And then as long as everyone moves forward,
it's just managing expectations. And I've cut 26, 27-minute sides that don't actually sound all that bad, which has surprised me. I've been like, whoa, all right. They're quieter than I would like, but they maybe don't have as many other issues as I would have thought. But that doesn't mean it's an ideal scenario, but you have to prepare people for like, not the consequences of their actions, because that sounds bad, but like what the possibilities might be going forward. So I would say in that case, just make sure you're on a level speaking term with whoever you're talking to, and just, manage expectations. It's always about managing expectations in any industry. And in particularly something like this, it's definitely that way.
Cool. So let's pop through a couple more questions. I've got this. Art wants to know, why do some new records have so few songs per side? For instance, Widespread Panic, Street Dogs is a double album in 1967 or 1979. Thanks. It would have been on one disc. Well, back when it was just one format, well, a lot of things. Basically, to answer your question point blank, it's for volume and fidelity. They can cut 3 songs on the outside of the record, not get into the weird spot. A double LP can be charged. You can charge 30, 35, 40 bucks for a double LP, but only the manufacturer only spends a few more dollars. And it's easier to sell something that's heavy and has two of them.
You can put an etching on the back side of one. I've done that for the Widespread Panic, where like the last side is just it's one song and it's like 15 minutes, and then the other side is like just an etching of whatever. It's a collector thing.
Yeah, did we cut that one? I know we cut the live. We're cutting the live albums.
Oh, I've cut multiple Widespread Panics now.
Right. And how did I think we got in this one? How did you get into vinyl cutting, and what?
Oh, how did I get into it? Okay, this is
the resources.
So there's like one book on disc cutting, at least that I know of, that's like been around forever. It's called like Basic Disc Mastering. It's a big book, and so that's like one of the few resources that I would find that I've found or that I know of that are kind of just like beginning of the process and how everything works. Unlike some other stuff in audio, again, like my background's in recording and mixing and stuff, and I've done some films and things, and you can never say that you can only learn things online, but there are certain things that, watching a YouTube video, you can at least gain a little bit of knowledge from. So like before I started doing any location sound stuff, I read some books on it. I talked to people. I tried to like learn best practices, and it was, you shadow people, but it was a lot of personal learning also. Whereas with cutting lacquers and working with vinyl, you almost have to work with someone. I mean, you have to. First of all, there aren't that many lathes. So, how are you going to, it's not like you can just go buy one at a Walmart or something. So you have to find someone who has that sort of experience with the equipment, who also has the equipment, who can teach you. And when I was in Chicago, Bob at Chicago Mastering Service was kind of like the person that taught me. It's a pretty in-depth process. And I did a lot of test cuts and and ran down sides and stuff way before I cut anything for real, because it's a learning process. You have to learn how the medium reacts when you put audio to it. You need to understand the whole side length stuff. How far apart do I have to space the grooves, and how loud do I have to make the audio going onto the record in order to make it fit? I mean, it's one of those things that if you're interested in it, I would find a person in your area who has a lathe, who's a cutting engineer, and just go and talk to them, and have a one-on-one discussion. Watch what they do. because I think that that's how you'll probably learn about the process the best. And obviously, there's videos on YouTube where you can like watch people cutting and stuff, which are fun to watch.
Yeah.
But
And then
yeah.
and we do the lathe night as part of our
Mhm.
tape camp twice a
Yeah.
year too. And you know, I know how to cut lacquers, and I read all the books and all that stuff, and it didn't make any sense to me. And once we got the lathe installed,
Mhm.
and Hank Williams taught me, once he showed me it moving and working when it did, it was like 1,000 light bulbs. It was
Yeah.
like,
You have to
oh,
see
I
it.
get it. This, and because it's so hard. And consoles are the same way. I could sit there and explain to you verbally how a console works, and you're like, what? And you start turning knobs. You go, oh, I get it. Um, and also, it's not the act of cutting a lacquer is not inherently hard. It's just hard to really get good at all the different kinds of music and expectations, right? Um, it's like golf. It's like, okay, you take this ball, you hit it over there in that hole, right? And then, okay, I know how to do it. I mean, let me pop this up. My one of the things I love is there's a tool for everything. This is my 11-year-old daughter. She knows how to cut lacquers. This is actually a video. This is her scribing her name into a lacquer she cut for a school project. So if you buy records, look at the inside and you'll see Maggie's name and the 79 stamp, or whoever cut the lacquer scribes their name into it like that.
I
It's
hope
kind of
you can
fun.
read it. My handwriting is not as neat as what some people's are. Mine's a little bit more chicken scratchy, but
Yeah,
so if it looks like
it's
someone's
fun.
doing this, it's probably me.
Yeah. Let's. There's some more questions, but let's also um, play some stuff too, right? Because music is fun. So one of the things that we do at 79, just because we always want to be really good at technology, but understand where all this technology came from and all that. So we often will print mixes to tape as part of our mastering process, and we're getting into doing that as part of our disc cutting process or an option for a variety of reasons. There's a theory we're working on that a lathe was designed before digital recording, so it will cut from a taped mix better, which kind of makes sense to us. Um, so I've got this streaming service actually allows me to play mixes and you can hear them. So this is one that hasn't been taped. I'm going to mute our microphones real quick. Sorry, I'm going to produce the show. And we'll play a little bit of it and we'll play the taped version. So hopefully you'll be able to hear the difference.
I wasn't always this way, I was pretty in denial. The second boys who spoke in, they would smile and I'd go quiet. I was shy and I was scared. Suddenly I woke up today like, hey, I'm pretty cool. Don't know how, but maybe it's a toothpaste that I'm using. It's the choices that I'm choosing. It's the walk that I am walking. Nothing I can do about it. I'm pretty cool, 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 I'm pretty cool. Figure out that.
Unmute myself. So listening to that, Maggie, you
Mhm.
know, what would you anticipate being what you have to work on to cut a lacquer from that song?
The vocals are something that in songs like that can be sometimes problematic with sibilants. So that was my
Mhm.
first. That would be my first concern. Everything else in the song was pretty tight, so I don't wasn't concerned about like low end distortion or anything like that. It was
Mhm.
mainly for me. It's a sibilance issue in that particular track. Um,
Yep.
so one of the things that again, tape is a tool like anything else, and one of the things that tape can do is help kind of soften some of those high frequencies and those sibilants that can make things a bit problematic. So I thought this was a good example of a song that benefited from being printed to tape because it kind of it rounded out the low end and softened it a little, and it also softened some of the sibilants that could have possibly been a problem in cutting.
Mhm.
So this to me was one of the two prime examples of the projects that we've done recently that really like benefited the most from this process. So that's what I noticed personally when I was doing this.
Yeah. So let's listen to the tape version and listen to the things that Maggie just described that she would have had to been aware of cutting it from a digital source. And now that tape does all the things it does. Let's listen to that.
I wasn't always this way, I was pretty in denial. The second boys were booking, they would smile and I'd go quiet. I was shy and I was scared. Suddenly I woke up today like, hey, I'm pretty cool. Don't know how, but maybe it's a toothpaste that I'm using. It's the choices that I'm choosing. It's the walk that I am walking. Nothing I can do about it. I'm pretty cool. 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 I'm pretty cool.
Yeah. So it also kind of glued together the snare and the hand claps too, because that high frequency would have been the high frequency limiter on a lathe is called the acceleration limiter, and tape slows transients down as part of its, you know.
Hmm.
So yeah, so that's something we're doing and having a lot of fun, and we use, of course, MAR machines at the kind of. So the machine we use is a restored one as well, so it's not just some tape machine. Let's look at some questions here. I love all these questions. That was at 15 IPS. Ben wanted to know that was at 15 IPS, quarter inch. Tends to have the most tape sound and tape saturation. I'm scrolling through questions. Here we go. Tom wants to know, what are the compromises you need to make when cutting a side greater than 18 minutes?
So I would say that side length is 18. You can still usually get a pretty loud cut, and I usually don't have to cut into that center, that half an inch. But if you have a longer side, and if I have to cut into that, so sonic quality on the last track can sometimes be an issue. Sometimes if an artist knows that their side is going to be pretty long, and they have the ability to do so, they will put the quieter, more ballad like, less cymbal heavy, delicate song in the inner groove, because more than likely if there is any high frequency distortion, you're not going to hear it as much. So sometimes that's a way to mitigate any issues that you might have with a really long side. It's kind of just the level at that point. Usually I just might have to turn it down. It's I that's kind of the only thing that I can really think of that is the biggest compromise. But besides the frequency content thing, it's kind of so.
Yeah.
Mhm.
We've got a level question here, and then I want to get into some mechanics of lacquers to plating. You mentioned that waves don't look like boxes. What's the general rule of thumb for peak level LFPs for vinyl? So go for it, Maggie. What
Um,
does LUF stand for, please?
Loudness units full
I,
scale. So
okay, because I didn't
if
forget that. So,
I know, well, there's so many different decibel suffixes.
yeah.
But yeah, so it's weird. I don't really think about LUFs with vinyl so much, mainly because to me it doesn't really work with the format. Just because the things I'm looking at, I mean, I have a TCM Clarity meter, so I can look at um, overall loudness for a side and that sort of thing. But for me, it's more when I look at my VU meters, that's how I determine if it's kind of loud enough for vinyl. So I try to make things, if I can have peaks being at 0 on the VU meter, and there's no distortion, there's no problems, like it's not skipping or anything, then I will cut it as loud as I can based on that. Usually what I find is that, again, this is all based on very general guidelines. It's always genre and music specific. But I find that average level for me tends to be somewhere around -3 and -5 per side, and in an ideal world, and peaks around -1 on a VU meter. I've noticed that, like, when I'm cutting, I have my M Clarity going and kind of reading the overall loudness throughout the side. And I noticed that most of the things that I think sound pretty good on vinyl where my VU meters are at a level that I like tend to be somewhere between -17 and -20 LUFS. But I don't think that necessarily, I wouldn't use that as a guide for myself. It's just what I happen to notice because I have that meter in front of me and I reset it when the side starts and I just look at what it, what it's doing. So yeah, so I don't necessarily use LUFS with vinyl in the same way that I might for like something I'm putting out on Spotify where, -14 LUFS is their standard or whatever. So
Okay, and then one quick one. What are the challenges of cutting a 45 7-inch, which basically is the MP3 of vinyl? So, is how,
people who think they can put like 6 minutes of music on a 7-inch 45, a lot of times it's just, okay, so sometimes I'm amazed when those things play at all. It's side length tends to be the thing that I notice the most being a problem, where people are like, here's my songs, and they want 5 or 6 minutes on a 7-inch 45. And it's better than a 7-inch 33. But you have to find a way to make that fit. So a lot of times I end up having to cut a lot more low end out of my cut because, lower frequency wave takes up more space, all that sort of stuff. So there's a picture of the grooves under a microscope. It's like 250 times magnification of the grooves. And those grooves are about 2 millimeters wide. So I would say that in the last couple batches of 7 inches that I've cut, and I don't cut too many of them, but for some reason when I do, they always tend to come in like groups of 5 or 6. It's usually the length of the side and the fact that I need to kind of use the entire little bit of space on the record to actually make everything fit. That being said, there's plenty of good sounding 7-inch 45s. It's just that's usually the bigger issue for me, is getting it loud enough.
And another thing for the format too, and Dale has a good question, is, vinyl is a format that the same song can sound completely different depending on 7-inch 45, 7-inch 33, 3-inch 30, 12-inch 33, 12-inch 45. If there's less songs on that side, that same song can sound different. It can sound different where it's placed on the record. It's not like putting it on tape or putting it in a Spotify playlist. What are the sonic quality differences of the two speeds, 45 RPM and 33 RPM?
So the main thing that I can say between those two is what we discussed earlier, with kind of the way that 33 RPM records handle high frequency content, particularly in the inner groove sort of department. The slower speed of the actual record contributes to some of that stuff. And I think that also when people are cutting a 12-inch 45, just from a subjective thing, is usually the sides are a lot shorter. Oh, my battery's messed up. I actually need to grab my phone charger because my phone's about to die.
Okay.
So
I'll handle this.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be right back.
Yeah. So a thing to think about with vinyl records anyway is it's not so much the cutting, it's the playback, right? So look at all those grooves right there, and think about how that's going to be played back. If that was a 45 RPM record, the grooves wouldn't have to move as much, and they wouldn't be as complex of a groove geometry. So then the turntable that you play it back from will have a better time and an easier time playing it back. So that has to do more with it too. The same thing with the 7-inch 45. The grooves you're cutting on a 45 are already towards the inside of the turntable to start with, which are the hardest to play back. So it gets into this, it's physics, and circles are weird. So it's not, a lot of times what we're working up against are things that can't be worked around. It's just how it's going to be. So we change the music to skirt the laws of physics. Do you work from pre-master file that has been compressed, EQ'd, or are you cutting from a raw mix?
It depends if I'm doing the mastering or not. So like from the beginning, so to speak. So let me describe these two different things. So there's mastering where I'm doing everything from the beginning, where like Chris or whoever gives me mixes, and I do the sequencing and all the EQ and all that sort of stuff. And then there's the situation where another mastering engineer has done the mastering for vinyl, and they send me files to cut from. So if, and I call those flat cuts. So if like you just give me mastered files and I cut from them, that's a flat cut, because I'm ideally, there's the closest correlation to what the mastering engineer used to be. I'm taking your files and transferring them onto a disk. My goal is to have the flattest transfer possible between digital file and record. I'm not trying to change things, so to speak. So in that sense, the adjustments I make are simply to make it work on the medium. So how I, what level I set things at. If I have to do any extra de-essing because maybe it's a little problematic in my test cuts, all of my adjustments are made to make that work on a record. I'm not trying to like remaster your audio. And it's interesting because over the years I've learned, like, because I get files from people I don't know too, or like, they come from everywhere. And I can tell when people have had experience with vinyl and when they haven't in terms of mastering, because when I load the files into Pro Tools or, whatever, Wavelab, whatever, and I look at them and I press play, I press spacebar, and I watch what the lathe does, and I watch what my VU meters do, you don't have to make as many adjustments with overall level or with, the acceleration limiters or anything. It's interesting because you can tell just from that first experience, like this person has either worked with a lathe or they've sent things to a cutting engineer enough that they know what they're doing. And I can cut most things well, but it's interesting when you like get that one experience where I'm like, wow, they like have it set perfectly. So like I don't even have to like move my overall output of my DAW. It's like they knew exactly what it needed to be set at for it to work. So that's fun when that happens.
Yeah. And there's a lot of misconceptions too that somebody might have mastered it wrong if it doesn't work for vinyl. And it's interesting because sometimes a really good digital master for Spotify, like a really, really good one, makes it harder to cut for vinyl. You have to kind of back out of it. So a lot of times, even though the mastering is great, we'll just ask for the raw mix just to master it specifically for vinyl, because it is two different formats, Dustin Blocker, he owns Hand Drawn Pressing in Dallas. So he's gleaning some stuff that he can send to artists because these are frequently asked questions. Well, let's segue into these questions have been so awesome, and they're all focused on how can we do this better on our end as clients and mixers and artists. And one thing I want to segue into is we're on that same path, right? We're trying to figure out how to do things better. Mm-hmm. And something that really shocked me was when you cut a lacquer, remember those grooves I showed you? That is a snapshot in time. I'm trying to find them again. Here we go. These grooves are cut into a soft lacquer. And like all things in nature, they want to go back to how they started, which was no groove at all. So once this is cut, that groove, all those cute little ridges right there are high frequency content. Well, those are going to start smoothing out, just like a footprint in the sand on a beach, right? You come back an hour, you put another footprint there, it's going to look dramatically different compared to the original. So the object is to get your lacquers into metal. Oh, let me take that out of there. Hang on. Take that out and put this in here to get your lacquers to this stage, metal, because then there's no more high frequency loss as soon as possible. And this was a well-known fact in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And like a lot of things we deal with, the facts have kind of faded over time and myths started coming up and all this kind of stuff. So we did what started out as an experiment and now is an example. It's an example. So what I did is we took a band that I produced and mixed, and we cut a lacquer, and we did it over like a Christmas break. So same style on the lathe, same batch of lacquers. We had a 2-week break. We cut a lacquer, set it on a shelf, came back after the holidays, 2 or 3 weeks later, pulled the next lacquer out of the box, same style, I cut it again, took it up to plating, processed it, and pressed it on side A of a record and a side B of a record. So same vinyl compound and everything. Essentially the same thing. And nothing was done differently except time had elapsed, right? So what I did is I took those two, that record side A and side B, played it into Pro Tools and edited it together. So what I want you to listen for is every 2 bars, if you count slow, every 2 bars it switches. So listen to the high frequency content, listen to the shaker, the snare, the vocal, and listen to it toggle. I'm going to mute us and hit play. And like I said, everything was done exactly the same, just time that lacquer had sat a little bit.
Wasn't impatient. It's just too long that I've been listening to. Why do you do such crazy schemes? Are you aware of the danger of existing in one place, running off in another? Are you existing in one?
So I was hearing a ton of changes on my laptop, okay? And I mixed that record, and to hear it in the control room where I mixed it and hear those changes, it makes me want to throw up. It's like a different vocal sound. That shaker is a solid 3 or 4 dB quieter. The snare drum has no impact. It's crazy. So part of our process is we have lacquer cutting and the metal work in the same building. So all of our lacquers get processed the same day or next day, but no more than 2 days. So that's a big part of how we make sure quality goes through the whole thing. Because like Maggie said, vinyl mastering is the last creative step and the first step in manufacturing. So it sits right at that point where all the creative decisions you've made from day one can erode if that lacquer sits around or gets shipped and sits in a belly of a plane in July, you know?
Yeah,
So
and if I can interject, if you guys are sending lacquers to us for electroplating, if you could send them, overnight FedEx, that would be great. Like, put it in the cost to your client if you need to, like, have that be part of the price or something. Because if we can get them, and not have to worry about, they're going to be sitting in a truck for 3 days, it would just be a really great thing for everyone involved. So if you're sending us lacquers, try to do that if you can. Try to send them overnight. Even though
Yeah.
I won't be dealing with them, but Sarah will be, and she would be very
Yeah.
happy.
And we're doing a whole one of these on plating on the 16th of April. So we're going to get into that too. But I mean, think about overnighting a lacquer is what, $70, but you've done mix tweaks to get that vocal just right and that shaker just right, or pick that microphone, and to have it sound like a cheap live microphone after just sitting around, it was just crazy. Let me think a couple of things. Oh, we've been talking a lot about terms like stampers and lacquers and stuff. If you want to email Maggie at mastering@welcome-to1979.com, we've got a nice glossary of terms we can send you that just kind of lets you know what each one of these things are. So as you enter this process, you can be better educated and just kind of know what terms we're talking about. And it's written in plain English.
Yeah, and if you guys
it's
have
really-
any other questions about mastering or anything too, like, feel free to email me and I'll try to get back to you as I can. So
Yeah. And we're still working. We have limited access to our facility due to the coronavirus. But Maggie's been loading projects in at home and all of that. So we're still working, and if you have the means, we'd love to be involved. One last thing we should talk about. This is something we offer that hardly anyone else does at the studio. It's called direct-to-disc recording. And here's Maggie and Anna doing, was that Old Crow maybe?
yeah.
Yeah, and we're going to do a whole series on this in I forget when, but in a few weeks. And Morgan from Old Crow is going to join us and talk about the artist perspective. So Direct to disc is recording an artist live to a vinyl master. So the nanosecond they hit a note, it's on on lacquer forever. So it's playing, recording, mixing, and mastering all live. It's a rush. So we'll get into that too. A couple more last questions, probably just one more to wrap up. I try to keep these at an hour. How much does mastering usually cost? How much do cars cost? No. We've got a great informative website with all the different options, Aaron. Welcome to 1979.com. But go ahead and give a couple, like a ballpark maybe, or at least how it operates.
Well, the way that we do things, I mean, again, it's project dependent, so I can tell you kind of our main variables, I guess. So it's per song, so it's $75 per song, and then we charge extra for electroplating and cutting lacquers and all that sort of stuff. It's kind of like an a la carte when it comes to the deliverables. So if you had a 10-song album, $75 a pop, $750 for just the straight mastering, plus other requirements you might have for whatever project. So that's usually how we do things. So
cool. Let's do one last question, because a lot of what we deal with are myths, and the whole thing won't be up there. But Richard wants to know, how come records often have different stamper numbers on each side? So if you use a dead wax, right? He wants to know if it's because stampers wear out quicker than others. It has nothing to do with the stamper. Maggie and mastering engineers like her scribe the record number on each side. It'll be 1979A for side A and B. And that will be on every set of stampers that were made from that lacquer. Now, if 2 years later we say, hey, we need to press 10,000 more records and we can't find the metal masters, then Maggie will cut another one, 1979 RE1A, and then every stamper from there will have that one on there. Or if I'm a record label, I send WAV files to 15 different mastering engineers all over the world. They each scribe that number differently, and that travels with every stamper and every record. So it's manufacturing at that point. So, but man, what a bunch of awesome questions. And if you watch this later, this will be on our Facebook page, and you have a question, you can email us, mastering@welcome1979.com. You can hit us up on Facebook. We'd love to answer your questions and be involved with your project. So send us some mixes to tape, send us some stuff. So, and with that, Ben says, thanks for our time, and thank you. Without your questions, we'd be sitting here just talking to each other. So I appreciate it. Be safe. After all this is over, we're going to have a big party and invite everyone over. So have a good day. All right.
Bye, guys.
Bye, Mindy. Bye.